Now to today's main event, and it's my great pleasure to welcome Brendan and his wife Anita to the BLSI. And I just want to tell you a little bit about Brendan. Brendan Sims is the Professor of the History of International Relations in the Department of Politics and International Studies at the University of Cambridge. He's also the founder and director of the Center of Geopolitics. He works on European geopolitics, past and present, and his principal interests are the German question. I'll ask him about that later, being given that I'm German. Britain and Europe, Hitler's global anti-Semitism, humanitarian intervention, and state construction, which obviously is very relevant to today. He advised governments and parliaments and spoken at Westminster, in the European Parliament in Brussels, and at various think tanks in the United Kingdom, the US, and in the various countries of the Eurozone. And he is a prolific author. He's written many books, including Europe, the Struggle for Supremacy, which I'm sure will feature to some extent today, Hitler's American Gumbo, Hitler, a Global Biography, The Silver Waterfall, How America Won the War in the Pacific, Britain's Europe, Unfinest Hour, and specifically, probably interesting of what's going on in the world at the moment, he might draw on his previous book on Donald Trump, The Making of a Worldview. And I, for one, will be very interested to see by what degree his thought has changed, because that book was written, I think, when he was Trump 1.0. Now we've got Trump 2.0. It'll be interesting to see whether today's talk will explore the difference. But obviously his latest book, which hasn't come out yet, but he's just finished in time for this talk, is The Return of the Great Powers. So without further ado, please give Brendan Sims a very warm welcome.
Well, thank you very much for that very kind introduction. It's a great honor to speak at the Bath Royal Literary and Scientific Institution. This lecture, as you heard, arises out of a book whose first draft I've just completed, a book on the great powers. So this is its first outing, and I'm feeling, I have to say, a little bit diffident about it. I'm looking forward to your questions. I can't promise I'll answer them in one sentence, but if you ask them in one sentence, I'm sure Andreas will be very grateful. So our topic tonight is the future of the great powers. And before addressing that subject, let us remind ourselves that 20 years ago, the great powers are actually widely believed to have no future. The end of the East-West confrontation after the Cold War and the simultaneous advance of what was widely called globalization suggested not the transformation of the great power system, but its redundancy. We observed during the last decade of the 20th century and the first decade of the 21st century the steady falling of barriers to trade, to travel, and migration. So great power rivalry and military pure competition seemed remote prospects. They even seemed somewhat quaint as topics, I would suggest. So I'm going to divide my remarks, which will last between 30 and 40 minutes, this evening into four parts. First of all, I'm going to have a brief look at where we've come from. So in other words, why the return of the great powers? Where do we stand today? Secondly. Thirdly, what might the drivers of the future be? And then I'll end with a brief imagining of some possible futures. In round about 2010, I would say there was little sign of the great power turbulence ahead. Not no sign, but little sign. The rules-based international order, which I summarized earlier, had survived the global financial crisis more or less intact. Globalization, this great economic integration of the world, was still in full throttle, with particularly impressive economic growth rates in India and the People's Republic of China. And while many people, even at that time, predicted that there would be ultimately some great showdown between the United States and China, this was in the context of an economic struggle, and that at some point, following the projections, the People's Republic of China would simply overtake the United States. And I'll come back to that theme later. In Europe, Russian sales of energy grew steadily, and the construction of a second pipeline across the Baltic Sea, the so-called Nord Stream 2, continued apace. The world seemed to be experiencing, to quote here Kishore Mahbubani, a very distinguished Singaporean diplomat, president for a while of the United Nations Security Council. Mahbubani put it, the world was experiencing, quote, a great convergence towards, quote, one world in which, quote, wars among major powers have become a sunset industry. That was written shortly after 2010. And one could see why he might have thought and written that. This optimistic outlook was shared by most Western politicians, business leaders, and much of the public sphere. President Barack Obama's 2010 US national security strategy, when describing, quote, the world as it is, spoke of a world in which, and I quote, for all its problems, the circle of peaceful democracies has expanded, the specter of nuclear war has lifted, and major powers are at peace. There was a general expectation that China would rise peacefully and become more liberal as it did so. In this world, there were no great powers, really. There was only one unique superpower, the United States, but there were no great powers, but only international governance. Corporations worried about regulation and what they called compliance, and periodically about terrorism or state failure. But they didn't really worry about geopolitics. And I know this because, having taught geopolitics, historical and present day, it was quite difficult to get corporations interested at that time in the phenomenon of geopolitics, because their line quite reasonably was, geopolitics is something of the past, and we are interested in compliance. In other parts of the world, though, especially Russia and China, great power politics remained the primary frame of reference. This became evident, of course, in 2014 with Vladimir Putin's annexation of Crimea and invasion of eastern Ukraine. Russia's seizure of territory from a sovereign state was the most fundamental breach of international law seen in Europe since the Second World War. The inability of Chancellor Merkel of Germany to understand this new trend was epitomized by her insistence at this time that Putin, quote, was living in the 19th century. In reality, of course, the Russian dictator was living in the 21st century, while the German leader was still mentally stuck in a bygone era, which was the era of the late 20th and the start of the 21st century. The People's Republic of China was less aggressive, but it also appeared to be acting according to a power political rather than a primarily economic rationale. In September 2014, for example, not much observed at the time, despite its growing trade relationship with India, the PRC provoked a confrontation at Ladakh along the disputed Sino-Indian border. China also intimidated Taiwan and advanced in the South China Sea, building bases on reclaimed islands in defiance of international law. So even at the beginning of the second decade of the 21st century, there were already signs of great power politics. So one way or the other, by the end of this decade, there was a widespread sense that the liberal international order was giving way. It hadn't quite given way yet, but was giving way to a new great power system. So the first US National Security Council, National Security Strategy of Trump, this is Trump 1, Andreas referred to my book, that National Security Strategy of 2017 spoke, quote, of a return to peer competition, which was a synonym for the return to great power politics, after decades of counterinsurgency and complex emergencies. Likewise, the then British Defence Secretary, Gavin Williamson, remarked in 2018, February, quote, we see a world of spheres of influence and competing great powers. Now, the coronavirus pandemic, which engulfed the world in 2020 to 2021, did not, as many expected, drive the major global actors to transcend their geopolitical differences. On the contrary, the crisis both aggravated and was aggravated by existing great power antagonisms. Once the pandemic had passed, its memory receded, rather like that of the Spanish flu after the First World War, while the great power ambitions and resentments remained unchanged. Geopolitically, its main legacy, the legacy of the pandemic, was a heightened sense of Western suspicion towards China, a feeling of abandonment by the West among the so-called rest, and, this is the critical point, a greater sense of anxiety around supply chain security almost everywhere. So the lens through which the pandemic was seen was increasingly the lens of interstate competition. In 2021-22, the great power contest resumed with increased vigor. Its epicenter seemed to be in Asia. I quote here President Joe Biden, of course, was inaugurated at the start of 2021. In April 2021, he says, quote, "We are in competition with China and other countries to win the 21st century." At around the same time, his Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, troubled by Russian rhetoric over Ukraine, warned the Kremlin that, quote, "the United States does not recognize spheres of influence." President Biden framed this contest against the Sino-Russian threat, which seemed increasingly one threat, as one between democracy and autocracy. And the issue of whether the West is facing a single threat or multiple threats is something I'll come back to later, because it's crucial for the question of whether we are living or will be living in a multipolar world or in a bi-order world. And there's an important distinction which I'll come back to in a minute. But Biden was at this time clear we were living in a world divided between democracy in the West, which was understood politically rather than geographically, and autocracy. Then, in February 2022, Vladimir Putin launched his full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Putin's attack revealed the extent to which the global order had shifted from the rules-based system to a more predatory great power system. The United Nations proved completely incapable of responding to a straightforward attempt at territorial annexation. The second, of course, in 8 years. The European Union, a geo-economic rather than a geopolitical power, was also out of its depth. The only two powers which reacted to considerable effect were Britain and America, whose intelligence services warned of the attack and which supplied Ukraine with military aid before the invasion. Now, the Western response to this crisis was, of course, to impose sanctions, to break to a considerable extent, though not completely, the energy link, the famous or infamous Nord Stream lines were shut off by the Russians, then they were blown up by persons unknown. And the result is that slowly but surely, globalization was being unwound. I quote here US General David Petraeus, well-known figure from the Iraq War and current commentator. He says, quote, 10 years ago, we were in an era of benign globalization. It was characterized by the barriers to investment, capital flows, trade, and so on, generally being reduced. But he says we're now in an era of renewed great power rivalries. You see barriers to trade, investment, and capital flows increasing. And all of a sudden, the corporate world now has geopolitical advisory and is very interested in great power conflict because, of course, it's affecting their business models very directly. So the world of 2024, towards the end of the Biden administration, was, I would suggest, a bi-order system. In other words, there were two orders in the world, with the United States, United Kingdom, the European Union, Japan, Canada, and various smaller powers as part of the Western democratic order, and Russia, the People's Republic of China, and their allies in the opposing Eastern and Southern autocratic camp, especially states like Iran, Belarus, and North Korea. Of course, if this clash of orders was the defining feature of the structure of global relations, it was not the only one. The individual members of both orders often continued to pursue aims which were unrelated or only tangentially related to the overarching struggle. And of course, two elements within those orders, European Union and the UK, continued to tussle around various issues. So not everything was determined by the clash of orders. And moreover, at least one major actor, India, was not aligned to either camp. And we can come back to that later in questions, if you like. So that is the position at the end of 2024. Moving to part two, the installation of the second Trump administration in early 2025 completely changed this picture, or appeared to. If during his first presidency, between 2017 and 2020, Donald Trump had pursued a policy of great power American dominance over both China and Russia, this time around, he seemed to have moved to a more multipolar understanding of the world. The distinction Biden had made between democracies and dictatorships gave way to a narrower focus of US interests as the administration understood them. In particular, he didn't bracket Russia and China together in the way that the first administration had tended to do. In February to April of this year, the Trump administration launched a number of initiatives which seemed to portend a fundamental shift in the structure of the international system, and perhaps even a reversal of international alliances. Washington started direct talks with Russia over Ukraine and signaled that it did not expect Putin to restore the borders of 2014, the date, of course, of the original aggression at the start of the Ukraine war. Trump tried to force Ukraine to sign its natural resources over to the United States as payment for past support. Neither Ukraine nor any European power was invited to the first talks in Saudi Arabia. It looked as if the future of the country would not be decided by any international rules, but simply by a deal between the great powers. More broadly, Washington seemed to be moving towards a new great power global cartel run by the United States, Russia, China, and perhaps India, but with no European involvement. I quote here the new Secretary of State, Marco Rubio. He says, quote, "Part of diplomatic relations is the ability to communicate with and manage problems with other great powers around the world and to avoid war and avoid conflict." He defined great powers as, quote, "big, powerful countries with a nuclear stockpile which can, quote, project power globally." Now, the next thing that the Trump administration did, of course, was to impose tariffs. In the first instance against more or less the entire world, but then zeroing in more specifically on the People's Republic of China. So the creation of great power cartel does not preclude individual great power rivalry, but the PRC has indicated that it will not accept discriminatory tariffs as they see it, without wishing to contest the truth content of either proposition, and in particular that they will not accept any third party discriminating against them because the Americans have insisted on it. And that's a dynamic, of course, that will lead to separate economic blocs. The other dimension of this is that the United States is effectively beginning to pass the security of our own continent, Europe, over to the Europeans. So if you think of this historically, from 1947 to 1949, the United Kingdom, which was the surviving European great power after the Second World War, European, that is to say, democratic great power, apart from the Soviet Union, in 1947, the UK handed the management of the Eastern Mediterranean, specifically of Greece, over to the Americans, and then with the creation of NATO in 1949, the security of the entire continent really passed to the Americans. They underwrote it, as we all know. But what's happening now, in effect, is that the Americans are handing that brief back to us. And in particular, in fact, to the United Kingdom. It's very interesting that the Americans have said that the NATO Committee on Ukraine should be chaired by a British figure. And so what you are beginning to see, at least in its infancy, is the separating out of the United Kingdom from the United States as a separate ordering system. So whereas over the previous 50, 60 years or so, it was quite difficult to imagine UK power as something separate from the United States because trained together, fought together. It was more a symbiotic relationship. Critics would call it something else, but to put a positive gloss, which is my own view, it was a symbiotic relationship. If you look at what's happened over the last days and weeks, you see the creation of an independent capacity to produce ammunition, which will no longer be dependent on American supplies, no longer dependent on American say-so for onward export. Very soon, the question of the maintenance of the nuclear deterrent, which is at the moment in the hands of the Americans, will also come up for discussion. So the United Kingdom, in other words, is on the way to becoming a separate ordering factor, distinct from the United States. So that's where we, I think, stand now. Of course, we may stand very differently quite soon because the situation is very volatile. Let me move on now to the future of the great powers and to enunciate, first of all, a couple of principles. But let me begin by saying that trying to predict the future of the great powers may seem foolhardy, and it is. Despite our attempts to anticipate events, we are constantly being surprised. 20 years ago, who would have foreseen Putin's full-scale invasion of Ukraine or the deployment of North Korean troops to Europe? That would have seemed a grotesque suggestion, something out of science fiction, and yet that is the reality today. Who expected that the US position in Afghanistan would collapse so quickly? Who predicted the 7th of October Hamas attacks on Israel? So I would say there are therefore two things one should never say about geopolitics. The first is, that will never happen. And the second is, he or she would never do anything as stupid as that. We should expect to be surprised, in other words. Now, the great powers, of course, are not the whole world. Humankind faces several critical challenges which transcend state boundaries and which cannot be resolved by national governments alone. Climate change threatens to dry out rivers, to flood large areas of low-lying land, and to aggravate resource scarcity. Mass migration threatens to hollow out some societies and to swamp others. Artificial intelligence, AI, could create an omnipotent entity beyond human control, with all the ethical implications for mankind and international governance. At the same time, the world is in the grip of the fourth industrial revolution. The rapid technological advances, in other words, which blur the physical, biological, and social worlds, at the very moment when its need for energy, including fossil fuels, has never been greater. Populist movements of the left and right, which give vent to frustration with established parties, are growing across the globe. Thanks to state action and popular pressure, the world is also deglobalizing. International trade and exchange is falling for the first time since the Cold War. Nevertheless, it is unlikely, although not impossible, that the global powers will suspend their rivalries in order to concentrate on the existential risks to mankind. A world state, which some saw as inevitable around the turn of the millennium, is now an ever more remote possibility. So is deeper international cooperation between the major global actors. Instead, as we shall see, the great powers will try to weaponize these challenges against their rivals. The arc of history today bends not towards cooperation, much as we might like it to, but towards competition. It is likely that the recently reconstituted great power system will evolve into a new equilibrium. And the question here, this is the fundamental distinction I want to make, is whether this will be closer to the bi-order structure, which is developed by the mid-2020s, which is really the Biden-era structure, or a truly multipolar system in which the poles are, if not equidistant, then at least meaningfully distinct. In other words, the United States would actually be a separate pole from the United Kingdom and the European Union and other Western-leaning poles. Not impossible, for example, to envisage a clash between the United States and the European Union over Greenland, which is part of the territory of a member of the European member state, Denmark. A lot will depend, of course, on which way the United States of America turns under Donald Trump. If, as appears to be the case, he reduces the country's commitment to Europe, increases attention to the Western Hemisphere, disengages from the global defense of democracy, and seeks a global accommodation with Russia and the People's Republic of China, then a new order will emerge in the second half of the 2020s. The resulting structure of international relations would revolve around 4 or 5 great powers, or large associations of powers. America would dominate the Western Hemisphere, drawing Mexico, Panama, and Greenland ever closer into its orbit. Russia would be the decisive force in post-Soviet Eurasian space, with or without Ukraine. China, with or without Taiwan, would overshadow its immediate neighborhood. So would India. The European Union would control the parts of the continent not held by Russia or the United Kingdom, and a few odds and ends like Norway or Switzerland. Britain could, in the political and the military sense, lead a free trading bloc made up of Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, Japan, and various smaller countries. These blocs would vary in size and importance, as the great powers always have. But with the exception of Russia, all of these powers or blocs would be economically potent. All would have significant military capacity, including nuclear weapons, and all, with the current exception of India, would have a veto at the United Nations Security Council, or access to one. Now, this framework is not dependent on the European Union cohering, either as a political union or as a confederation of larger member states led by France or Germany. The new dispensation could function without any mainland European involvement, which is why the European Union is reacting so allergically to the Trump phenomenon. And if that were to happen, it would render mainland Europe really a vacuum to be contested by the United Kingdom, Russia, and possibly the United States. But for the Europeans to join the ranks of the great powers in whatever form, they will have to acquire a military spine, which is at present supplied by the Americans. If Trump pulls out, the continent risks becoming invertebrate. One of the features of this new great power system would be its compatibility with economic deglobalization. Each bloc would form a large enough entity to constitute a viable market. In most cases, it would also be autarkic in terms of foodstuffs and energy. The exception here would be the People's Republic of China, which lacks really enough energy and foodstuffs. Ideologically, the system would be as heterogeneous as it is today, with democracies in some of the blocs and dictatorships or hybrid forms of governments in others. No two sets of governmental arrangements would be alike, and so the great power order would tend, as in a way it always has historically, towards the preservation of the global diversity of political systems, which of course is countervailing to the alleged trend of globalization, which saw us all heading towards some form of liberal modernity. What such a structure of international power would not guarantee would be the functioning of the institutions of global governance set up after the Second World War, in other words, the UN system and the other institutions. The future would be decided, as the former EU High Representative for the Common Foreign and Security Policy, Cathy Ashton, recently predicted, by, quote, great power deals, not international law. If this new great power order proved durable, the structure of international governance would evolve accordingly. For example, by finding a Security Council seat for India, or establishing a new structure which better reflected global power political realities. Now, of course, it's possible that this multipolar system, which seems to be the one we're heading towards under Trump, could give way to a restored by-order system, in other words, reversing to the Biden system, after the end of the Trump era. And this would once again group the United States, United Kingdom, the European Union, Japan, and various smaller allies in a single Western democratic order. This would be economically heterogeneous, with several different regulatory systems, but it would be geopolitically coherent, and its principal adversary again would be autocratic Eastern order. But even if that were to happen, that would not mean a return to globalization. In other words, we can go back to 2020, but not, I think, to 2010. Because what was striking was that when Biden came in, he did not reverse the Trump tariffs. He introduced the CHIPS Act, which was part of the sort of tech decoupling from the PRC, introduced the Inflation Reduction Act, and so on and so forth. And so very likely, even were there to be a Democratic administration from 2028 or a more international Republican one, we would still be back in a by-order world, not in a globalized world. Whatever system ultimately emerges, it will be subject to changes which we cannot yet conceive. Some powers, most probably France and Russia, will lose importance, and others may gain it. Some powers will appear, perhaps unexpectedly, as Prussia once did in the 18th century. Andreas referred to my work on the German question. Prussia just, for many, appeared out of nowhere and then became a great power. Other powers will literally disappear, perhaps equally unexpectedly, as the Soviet Union did. None of the major actors, in fact, are completely immune to this danger. Rather than being straightforward unitary nation states, America, Russia, China, India, Britain, and the EU are all either unions, empires, or confederations. They are all vulnerable to disintegrative forces, at least if history is anything to go by. The United Kingdom, for example, faces a challenge from Scottish, Welsh, Irish, and to a certain extent, also English nationalists. Russia has appeared on the verge of fragmentation on a number of occasions in the recent past. Think of the Prigozhin revolt in the summer of 2023. Came out of nowhere. Could happen again. China is racked by severe internal divisions between maritime and interior provinces and between ethnically distinct regions like Xinjiang and the central government. India faces similar problems, Kashmir being the most extreme example. The European Union, as we all know, is quite often in danger of dissolution. Even the United States is at risk of imploding. For example, if Donald Trump were to attempt to run for a third term, or if either side were to contest the outcome of the next presidential election. Something more likely, really, than not. If the risk of civil war between the great powers is high, though, especially given the propensity of rivals to stoke domestic discord, that of war between the great powers is even higher. This will be true whether the structure of world politics is multipolar or by order. Because if Trump succeeds in his aim of creating a system of largely autarkic great powers who run the world as a cartel, you might think that the risk of war would lessen. That is actually his intent. It is his belief that good fences make good neighbors, and that we basically disentangle our systems. But of course, that depends on the subsequent demarcation of spheres of influence being accepted by all sides. And we're already seeing that Xi is not accepting the tariffs, and we are already in the foothills of a confrontation on that. And with the by-order system, well, conflict is more or less inevitable. because the minimum understanding of security of democratic powers will be incompatible with that of Russia and the People's Republic of China. We see this already in the confrontation over the Russian attack on Ukraine and any confrontation that would result from an attack on Taiwan. And the question of whether a power will rise or not will be very materially affected by this new geopolitical dispensation, because the calculation I alluded to at the beginning of my lecture, which was the calculation around globalization, was one of a continuous upward projection of Chinese economic power. And therefore you could work out the moment at which it would surpass the United States. In a situation of deglobalization, or at least partial deglobalization, the calculation is completely different, because the PRC risks being cut off from markets and being cut off from raw materials. And it's already behaving as if that is a danger, has been for some time. And to understand what that means, think back historically to the position of the German Reich between 1914 and 1918 and 1939 and 1945. If you were to add up all the areas controlled by the German Reich in the First World War and added it up according to the peacetime GDP of 1913, you get to a very high figure. And the same is true of, say, 1942. If you add up what they actually control in a situation of conflict, it is the opposite, because they are unplugged. They were unplugged from the global system. They were cut off from their markets, from the raw materials. So actually, in some cases, they had basket cases. They had difficulties feeding the population. And that is the nightmare that the People's Republic of China faces in the context of geopolitical competition. So we cannot assume it will necessarily surpass the United States economically. But even a return to the rules-based, economically globalized international order will not guarantee peace. History shows that interdependence has neither stopped nor shortened war. It was a globalized Europe that went to war in 1914. It went to war, and it was a long war, contrary to expectation of many at the time. And the evidence of the 1930s shows that autarky does not prevent conflict either. War, in fact, is quite hard to stop. The critical moment in any great power system is when the previously dominant state is overtaken by its challenger, or is about to be. The Harvard political scientist Graham Allison has shown that this almost always involved war. For example, when France overtook Spain in the 17th century, Britain overtook France in the 18th century, and Germany and Japan attempted to overtake the British Empire and the United States in the 20th century. The only two peaceful power transitions of modern times were that from the British Empire to the United States and the disintegration of the Soviet Union, which paved the way for the recent period of US unipolarity. But I'm afraid a peaceful transition from US to Chinese global hegemony is almost unimaginable. An important variable in all of this will be the time factor. Historically, major wars have tended to happen when moments were seized or when powers felt that they were running out of time. In 1740, for example, Frederick the Great precipitated the War of the Austrian Succession by attacking the Habsburgs at a uniquely vulnerable time, because Maria Theresa was young, inexperienced, contested on all sides. British were busy elsewhere, Russians were busy. Unique moment, let's seize it. Germany felt it was running out of time in 1914 and 1939, deciding to strike before it was too late. Putin seems to have been driven by similar concerns in February 2022. And we know that in China, Xi has stipulated 2027 as the date by which the People's Liberation Army should be ready for conflict with the United States. So let me turn finally to some imagined future scenarios briefly. What might the interplay of the great powers have in store for us? Some of the most intense contestations will take place at the global level. These will involve the clash of narratives and stories in cyberspace as the powers seek to weaponize competing claims about democracy, the rule of law, and inequality. There will be attacks on rival critical infrastructure and intellectual property. The great powers will battle for markets and for regulatory dominance over the right to set rules and standards. In the physical world, the great powers will face off over access to foodstuffs, energy supplies, and critical metals to power the green transition and other raw materials. They will also seek to reshore, or at least to friendshore, key manufacturing capacities and supply chains. We already see this happening in the United States. The great economic decoupling between the US and the PRC will probably deepen and embrace ever greater parts of the world. The Biden-era distinction between a clearly defined area of non-cooperation and a much wider space of continued trade has already been abandoned by Trump. But even if this distinction, the so-called small yard and high fence, in other words, we only try to discriminate on critical areas, even if that is maintained or is resumed under a subsequent US administration, it will prove impossible to maintain in practice. First, because the nature of the world economy itself, which is increasingly driven by the sensitive technological advances, which the West does not want to share with the PRC and other systemic rivals, and they, by the way, pulling ahead in many respects from us, will not want to share with us. Secondly, because while the process of decoupling was started by the West, it will be completed by the PRC as it seeks to mitigate its own vulnerabilities. So once this starts, it's already started, it's quite difficult to stop. The truth is that economic globalization and its associated full-scale interdependence were only possible in the unique conditions of post-Cold War US-led unipolarity, or if one prefers, the liberal international order. It cannot survive the return of the great powers. This is because, as Eddie Fishman's trilemma has it, Washington, Beijing, Brussels, Tokyo, London, New Delhi, and Moscow know that you can only have two of the following three at the same time: economic interdependence, economic security, and geopolitical competition. So you can have economic interdependence and economic security, but not if you have geopolitical competition. You can have geopolitical competition and economic interdependence, but then you will not have economic security, and so on. So that's our trilemma, which was resolved by globalization, but has now burst forward again. So where will this go? Well, this is just my hunch. I think Russian and Chinese attempts to construct an alternative to the Western order, that attempt will dominate geopolitics at the global level, for example, by trying to establish reserve currency to challenge the dollar. Both powers will also continue to try to divide Western societies domestically. They are likely to succeed in several respects, but I think to fail overall. If American populists of most stripes are susceptible to Russian blandishments, those on the right are even more anti-Chinese than the mainstream. If German, French, and Hungarian populists tend to be both pro-Russian and pro-Chinese, those in Poland and the Nordic states are not. They tend to be anti-Russian. In the United Kingdom, interestingly, and I say so far, neither Russia nor the PRC has much political traction outside of the extremes. Likewise, the Russo-Chinese axis may be able to mine a rich seam of anti-Western resentment among the global majority, but it will struggle to persuade key actors to align with them in a contest against the West on a permanent basis. India and Vietnam, for example, are Russian allies, but much closer to the US than they are to China, which they fear and detest. The rest is just geopolitically far more divided than the West. Most of it will also think twice about being shut out of the global system in terms of trade, dollar access, and educational opportunities. Politically and emotionally, the world may divide into Western and anti-Western camps. But geopolitically, some non-Western powers, as I suggest, will ultimately align with the West or attempt to remain neutral. But one way or the other, the results will be a very different geo-economic order than the one which has emerged over the past 20 years. Trade will be largely within rather than across orders. Progressively cut off from its principal markets and sources of raw materials, the Chinese economy will fall back behind that of America and its allies, for the reasons I've given. It remains to be seen whether India, which will surely continue to straddle the orders, is able to move into the gap. The already inadequate international collaboration to combat climate change, water shortages, and other global challenges will shrink. Indeed, great power politics will not only cut across such collaboration, but will aggravate these phenomena and in turn be aggravated by them. Migration flows driven by political instability or economic inequality will continue to be manipulated, for example, by Russia to undermine rivals. The quest for critical metals to power the green transition will also remain a matter of deep contention between the major actors. Now, these contests will unfold in their specific geographic contexts. In Europe, Russia and the West will confront each other in Ukraine, the Baltic, and in the Arctic high north, where global warming is in the high north, global warming is rapidly changing the geography and thus the geopolitics by opening up ever greater areas to mineral exploitation and shipping. We will also confront in the Mediterranean and perhaps Central Europe. Given Russia's historical tendency to oscillate between a principal Western and periodic Eastern orientation, there may also be a Sino-Russian confrontation in the Far East. There will be a continued regulatory battle between the EU and the UK over the British Isles and Gibraltar, and perhaps also a three-sided contest between Russia, the EU, and the UK for dominance in the North Sea, North Atlantic, which is not only an important maritime thoroughfare, but home to vital sources of energy. Now, it's an open question the extent to which the United Kingdom will be able to re-establish more or less full regulatory control over its territory. Something we could discuss. In the Indo-Pacific, the United States, the UK, Australia, Japan, and their allies will try to keep China pinned behind the first island chain, in other words, behind Taiwan and the Ryukyus, Okinawa. The main areas of confrontation will be the South China Sea and especially Taiwan, which is not only claimed by the PRC as part of its national territory, but is also the world's most important manufacturer of microchips. China is unlikely to precipitate conflict unless it feels itself boxed into a corner, either by the recognition of Taiwan as an independent state or by the loss of its markets and raw materials. The decoupling of China from the global economic system will continue apace, not least because neither side can afford to remain dependent on market supply lines or critical infrastructure, which leave them at the mercy of the other. To a certain extent, some European countries may attempt to decouple from the decoupling, but I think that will fail because I think the European Union will find itself facing off not only against Russia, but also increasingly against the People's Republic of China. And finally, there are at least 4 theatres in which the great powers could be plunged into a catastrophic conflict, possibly including the use of nuclear weapons. First, in Europe, where Russian aggression could force NATO to respond. Secondly, on the Korean Peninsula, where Kim might attack South Korea, which is defended by a large American garrison. Thirdly, in the Taiwan Straits, if Xi misjudges US willingness to defend the island. Fourthly, in the South China Sea, where the danger is perhaps the greatest, given the lack of a well-established playbook of de-escalation established over time. We have that for Taiwan, but not so much for the South China Sea. The world has been lucky so far, but at some point, somewhere, deterrence will fail. The immediate danger is that the process of economic decoupling sets in train a dynamic which leads via tariff war with China to armed conflict. If the PRC feared humiliation or impoverishment at America's hands, it might well respond aggressively. Beijing could also feel its hand being forced by a Taiwanese declaration of independence. In Europe, Putin could find himself backed into a corner from which he would lash out. And indeed, he spent the past decade painting and putting Russia into just such a corner. It's part of his strategy. As in 1941, a Sino-American war could then merge with a European conflict between Russia and NATO to form a global conflagration. Now, it's often said that only a truly global effort, either by a world government or a coalition of governments, will be able to address existential challenges like climate change or nuclear conflict. That may be so, but for the reasons I've given, I fear, international rivalries will prevent any such cooperation from coming about in future, just as they have in the past. The end of great power politics will not be possible without the end of history. And if there's one thing we know about history, it is that it will never end. The great powers, like the poor, will always be with us. Thank you for your attention.
Wow, there's so much to unpack there, Brendan, and thank you very much for a very erudite account of the past, present, and potential futures of geopolitics. It just reminded me, just looking at this map, which we've been looking at for the last hour or so, it's not difficult to see why Trump might want to have Canada and Greenland, because it will give him a surface area of the world which is similar to Russia. It gives him a good space. The one thing we haven't talked about, and I'm sure will come out in the Q&A session, is there's certain parts of the world that are probably going to be used for resources, like Africa, South America, Australia. And I think the other thing that sort of struck me is, I'm not surprised the Germans and the Europeans are in an existential angst looking at that, because now they have to look after themselves and are not necessarily prepared to do that just now. So as the Chinese curse says, may you live in interesting times, is eerily relevant to today. So we now come to the Q&A session. I'm sure there will be lots. The online side is already taking off, and I'm sure we'll talk that. But can I please remind you, online as well as in the room, if you could ask a short question, a one-sentence question, then we get through far more. Who would like to start in the room? We've got two gentlemen in the back. We'll start right at the back and then go forward.
Thank you for an interesting lecture, Professor. You haven't mentioned BRICS or the emergence of BRICS as a political or as a political entity or an economic entity. Would you make any comment on that?
Thank you. Yes, so I alluded to the BRICS indirectly in my reference to the anti-Western bloc. I did actually have a brief discussion, but I cut it out for time reasons. So the BRICS, just for those of you who aren't completely familiar with the concept, is an idea coined, in fact, by a Goldman Sachs banker called Jim O'Neill about 20 years ago, where he said that Brazil, Russia, India, China, and then they added South Africa, that these were the up-and-coming rising powers that would supplant effectively the West, and that we needed to look forward to a different international system to recognize that fact. And what I was alluding to in the lecture is that actually the BRICS they may be a sort of geocultural and to a certain extent a geoeconomic organization, but they are not a geopolitical organization. And the reason being they are fundamentally divided by the fact that two key members of the BRICS, India and the People's Republic of China, are on violently hostile terms. And therefore it is not possible to have a single BRIC position on the major global issue. That's why I made reference on a number of occasions to India's unusual position in this framework.
Thank you. Another question.
Yes, thank you for your lecture. One absence from your parameters, as it were, on future development is demographics, rapidly changing demographics, because we have the imminent collapse of Chinese population from the one-child policy. Russian fertility is record low levels, Western European as well. What impact will future demographics, because this baby bust is going to be arriving very shortly?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Again, I alluded when I was talking about Putin's fear of running out of time. Demographics, indeed, is a major part of his calculation, and you see this both in terms of his pro-NATO policies, which are not succeeding within Russia, also his attempts, in a sense, to grab the Ukrainian population. And of course, the carrying off of thousands of Ukrainian children is part of this concern around demographics. And you're quite right, obviously, also about China's demographic crisis. But my topic is the great powers, as opposed to the economic and social and cultural development. Obviously, the two can't be separated. But I think that even if China were to suffer that demographic cliff, as it appears to be according to calculations, it will still be economically and militarily a huge power. And the reason why I say this is just look at Japan. Japan has suffered a big demographic dip. It suffered a big economic dip after the 1990s, but it is still, what is it now, number 3, periodically 4, depending on the exchange rate with Germany. The reason why Japan is not as big a great power as it might be is nothing to do with its demographic weakness or its economic weakness. It's to do with its historical culture. So I'm simply saying that even if you have that kind of demographic dip, there's still a considerable lag effect economically. So it would take a very, very long time for that to feed through to bringing down the PRC in great power terms, much longer than the kind of scenario I've been describing is, what happens if they're simply cut off from the global system? That would be a very quick death. What you're describing is realistic, but it would be a slow death. I hope that makes sense.
Okay, are there more questions in the room? Otherwise, I'll go online. Oh, there's loads of questions. Okay, we have one more question by the lady here, and then we'll go online for a couple and come back.
Thank you. Professor, you talked about cartels. What really affects me is where the UN, what's the role of the United Nations then? Because you saw the ASEAN, was changed with World War II, and are we now, where's the international law, where the United Nations? You said maybe India would get its seat, but it's irrelevant. Yeah. It would be irrelevant. Would the UN still exist?
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right, and that's why I said in the lecture that what this new system will not provide is the structure of international governance, which grew up after the Second World War, was not really functional during the Cold War for Cold War reasons, but then did begin to unfold after 1990. All of that has gone into reverse, and we see that in the discussions around Ukraine, and in particular, in the recent weeks and months, where you have discussions in Saudi Arabia, in which, not only the United Nations is not present, but not even the Europeans are not present. So yeah, you're absolutely right. This great power world is not the UN world. Although, of course, the UN does, and this is worth mentioning, the UN does reflect great power principles through the structure of the United Nations Security Council, where you have the veto right of the 5 veto-bearing powers. And so that even in its ideal, or what now seems like the ideal form of the UN, it still had a very hefty great power input.
Okay, we're now literally going off the planet. How will the changing geopolitical transformation work out in space, given that private investment is also making great inroads in space exploration?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. In fact, there's a book by Tim Marshall on this, which I read a while back and was very instructive. And this is a whole new area of geopolitics. And of course, it affects not merely space itself, but also dry land, as it were, because if you think of the Ukraine war, the availability of the Starlink satellites and so on was very helpful for the Ukrainians, and it's been a major anxiety for them that Elon Musk might turn them off. Whether this is going to be a scenario where private enterprise is so important, I'm not so sure. One of the points I didn't talk about it in this lecture, but one of the points that I make in the book is that actually what we've seen over the last few years has been the big corporations, particularly tech, actually rowing in behind governments, acting as the arm of governments. So I think that even if you have Elon Musk active in space, as you do, he will be doing that, on government contract, basically at the request of government. So it will be, yes, an area of great power contestation. It already is to a certain extent, despite the attempts to render space a conflict-free zone. That happened, by the way, in the Arctic until very recently. The Arctic was not a great power area of conflict, but the cooperation on the Arctic Council really broke down after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and we're seeing similar phenomena now in space.
Okay, all the way from space to good old Blighty. Does the UK need to revive its old empire and Commonwealth relationships to protect its influence and power?
So that's a tricky question, because of course the UK faces, and always has faced, in two broad directions. One is towards the continent of Europe, of which it is itself a part, and the other is more globally. And so the maintenance of Commonwealth relations, but also relations beyond the Commonwealth, very important. Actually, more important, I think, than many of the Commonwealth relations are relations with countries like Japan, which have recently improved massively. Think of the Hiroshima Accords, think of the Carrier Strike Group, for example, is departing in the next few days, and it's going to go to South Korea and to Japan. So it's not just a Commonwealth trip. So I would say the global relations need to be activated, not just the Commonwealth ones. And that distinction, I think in geopolitical terms, the connection to some non-Commonwealth countries is actually much stronger than it is to the Commonwealth ones, many of which are, for cultural and economic reasons, more in the not quite pro-Russian camp, but certainly in the skeptical, Western skeptical camp, for reasons that are historically conditioned. Whereas that's not true of South Korea and Japan.
Okay, well, the UK better act fast in terms of Canada, given that Mr. Trump has his beady eye on it. Right, next question in the room. So we've got one at the front.
Qualification to be a great power, you seem to imply or quote a source of having a really credible nuclear arsenal. So in that case, three great powers. Could Europe in any way qualify? And if so, surely that is greater UK-European cooperation.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And what's been interesting over the last while has been the increased saliency of nuclear weapons, which really didn't figure. They figured in our imaginary and concern in the 90s and the early 2000s in the context of rogue states, but not in the context of peer competition. And the Russians, of course, were very upset about this because they had held on to their arsenal and modernized it to a certain extent, and they were very insistent how important this was. And you saw how important it was at the beginning of the Ukraine war, where Putin came out and basically threatened, if you support Ukraine, you must take into account a possible nuclear response. Now, he was to a certain extent bluffing on that, but we didn't know that until some time later. But to answer your question more specifically, how credible is the European deterrent and what would need to be done? So, as you know, there are two deterrents. There's the UK one, the French one. The French have got a few more warheads. They always would, wouldn't they? They always like to have a few more. But the really critical point is that the French deterrent is autonomous from beginning to end. So they develop their own weapons, they produce their own weapons, they maintain their own weapons, and they can be independently delivered. And they have two delivery systems, air-based and sea-based. Our system is independently deployable, so if the PM were to decide to, God forbid, to launch a weapon against country X, he can do that. He doesn't need the American permission, he doesn't even need American information to do that. So that can be done. But if Donald Trump were to say tomorrow, we are no longer going to maintain the UK weapons, then quite quickly the UK deterrent would become inoperable, or at least inefficient. And some of the recent trials haven't been exactly confidence-inspiring. So where I think we go from there is, and I alluded to this briefly in my lecture, is that Europe as a whole, but in particular the United Kingdom, needs a more credible deterrent, and that for the UK means more warheads, independent development and production and maintenance, and in particular probably another method of deployment. In other words, not just the continuous at sea deterrent of the submarine, but perhaps also an air-launched system. I think it is inevitable that the discussion will come round to that quite soon.
Okay, thank you. And there's another question here.
You mentioned Japan's history as, or cultural history, and as a reason for its current position. Wouldn't China's cultural history of pulling back within its own borders, while the United States and Britain and the colonial powers went all over the world, wouldn't that, I mean, what sort of conflict do you imagine after 2027 is the question?
Well, I think it's a good question, but I think the key issue is how does the People's Republic of China understand the borders? In other words, are we talking about the current borders, or are we talking about the historic borders with the tributary system? So, for example, obviously it regards Taiwan as part of its historic area. It regards, with the South China Sea, it's put forward the so-called 9-dash line, which puts all of that within the PRC. It regards the so-called unequal treaties with the Russians, which the Russians grabbed a lot of this territory here in the late 19th century. I mean, there have been periodic treaties since, but basically that's potentially also in discussion. There was a big bust-up along the Ussuri River in the late 60s between the Soviet Union and the PRC, and so on and so forth. They regard the Ryukyu Islands or Okinawa as part of the tributary system. So, you know, for instance, the PRC's propaganda is now targeting the Ryukyus, saying, you know, the water's lovely, come in, join us, and the Japanese are very upset about it. So you asked where the points of tension are, that's where they would be.
Professor Sims, thanks for a very good talk. I'd like to ask a very parochial question. You talked about the fact that you indicate that you think the UK may become even more decoupled from Europe and more integrated with a kind of global free trading bloc. My question then is, where does that leave Ireland, north and south, and the prospects of a united Ireland?
Okay, that's, so in the lecture I left it open. I said the question is, will the UK go this way or that way? And that's of course in contention. It seems to seesaw. So many of the discussions that are right at the moment around the Security Pact, around the phytosanitary conditions around fish, tend to suggest regulatory convergence with the rest of Europe, but it could be yanked in the other direction as well. So, but to answer your question about, so I'm a Dubliner, so I think a lot about this. And I don't think there will be, if by United Ireland you mean the unification of the 6 counties with the 26. I mean, of course, prior to 1921-22, there was a United Ireland, but it was part of the United Kingdom. But if you mean that, I think that is unlikely because I think there was a kind of peak moment immediately after the Brexit vote where there was a lot of turbulence and many things seemed possible. But I think now even the opinion polls have been going. I mean, there was a surprise opinion poll it was a surprise to people in the Republic when they read in the Irish Times opinion poll that it was almost twice as many people in the 6 counties did not want to join in United Ireland as wanted to join, which was many more skeptics than had been the case, say, in 2018, 2019. So I don't think that is likely. What I think is more, I mean, not in the foreseeable future, what I think is the more interesting question is where the whole island of Ireland, but in particular the Republic now sits geopolitically. Because if you think of the position of the island of Ireland historically, I mean, we all know it's a very turbulent, unhappy history. But if you compare the history of Ireland to, say, the history of Poland, it's a much more positive history. So in the 20th century, to be stuck between Germany and the Soviet Union or Russia is much more unpleasant than to be stuck between the United Kingdom and the United States, even though there were all the troubles that we know about. Now, with Trump and with Greenland, it's a slightly different geopolitical situation. This whole area here, which had been very quiet and very stable for a very long time, is no longer as quiet and stable. And add to that all the difficulties that the Republic will have because of its corporation tax and because of its trade balance with the United States and so on. Its geopolitical position is now very different from what it was maybe immediately after the Brexit vote, where it sort of thought, well, it was on the bigger team, in the EU. So I think there are actually quite a lot of discussions happening in the Republic around neutrality, how viable is this, and so on and so forth. And that's what I think is probably the more interesting discussion than the one around unification or 32-county republic.
Okay, we've got a couple of questions online now to go to. One is, so far you have not mentioned Africa and South America. China is devoting a huge effort to establish primacy in trade in both of these continents. How could this affect the equilibrium that you mentioned?
Yeah, really good question. It was in the longer version, but I cut as I went along to keep to time. Absolutely correct. Africa in particular has been an area of resource conflict. And what's interesting, it's not just as the questioner quite rightly points out, that the PRC is very active in Africa economically, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of locating critical and extracting critical metals, but the Russians also. And the big struggle here has actually been between the French and the Russians. And at the moment, the Russians are winning in West Africa. I mean, the French are essentially withdrawing. So yes, Africa is a critical space in this. And in fact, resources are being, the Russians are controlling mines in Africa and using the resources from those mines to help fund the war in Ukraine. So these things are all connected, absolutely.
Okay, another question is a fascinating talk, but I wonder if it exaggerates the influence of Britain. Britain has 2.5% of GDP, the EU has 16%. It seems unrealistic to see Britain as anything remotely close to a global power.
Right, so the question is, what are the comparison, the great powers are certainly the United States and the PRC. After that, it gets difficult. You see, I wonder, does the questioner consider the Russian Federation a great power? And if so, why? Because the Russian Federation's economy is considerably smaller than that of the UK. The only reason why one we would consider Russia a great power is because of its nuclear arsenal, which it has paid for and built up. So if Russia is a great power, then certainly the UK, which of course has the capacity to build up its resources, I think would be likewise. It is also, the UK is the 5th or the 6th largest economy in the world. So if we're looking at a great power world of roughly 5 great powers, if we look at, in the book, I choose 4 criteria: resources, reach, reputation, and resilience. So in resource terms, the UK, yes, economically is weaker than, say, the United States and the PRC, but in military terms is stronger than the larger economy of Japan or of Germany. And of course, the European Union is not a great power. It is not a state. It has not behaved like a great power. It is a geo-economic and geo-legal ordering system. And that ordering system can do a lot in the world, but it's generally effective against its cognates. So the European Union is effective against the United Kingdom and is effective against the US in a geo-economic ordering sense, but it is not very effective against the Russians. Whereas the United Kingdom is actually more effective against the Russians. So you see this, for instance, in Northern Europe and the Baltic. If you ask people in the Baltic states, in Sweden and in Finland, if the Americans are out of the picture, who do you call? They all say London. That is the case. And we know that because when Finland and Sweden joined NATO, there was then a lag between the point of joining and the kicking of the Article 5 guarantee, in which you're particularly vulnerable. They asked for and received bilateral guarantees from the UK, which was a clear indication that they regard the UK as their primary provider within Europe. Obviously, the Americans are more important. So for all those reasons, I think that the United Kingdom is indeed a great power. But it is a great power on the margins, just as Russia is. And if France is a great power, it is on the margins. So in the book, I have a question mark of the United Kingdom, but it's definitely there in contention. And in fact, and this is really the point I was trying to make when I was talking about the UK separating out from the US, in fact, the UK is becoming more important with the receding of the American input in Europe. And that is actually one of those issues where the relationship with Europe, I think, in my opinion, is badly understood, because there is a school of thought which says if the Americans retreat from Europe, that makes the UK more reliant on the European Union. Whereas my argument is it makes the European Union more reliant on the UK. And I think what we've seen over the last years or so have shown that that's the case. It's not an argument that had much traction immediately after the Brexit vote, but because of the events vis-à-vis Ukraine, is now much more widely accepted, particularly, as I say, in Northern Europe and Scandinavia.
Thank you, Brendan. There's another question online, and that is, looking ahead, how secure is the resource-rich Eastern Siberia to the future predation by the PRC?
That's a really good question. And I mean, Putin, in fact, visited a town in right in the Eastern Province, in the Pacific Province, about 20 years ago, and noted the the decrepitude of the town on the Russian side of the border and the glittering Chinese metropolis on the other side with all the lights. And you see it, on Google Maps and so on. Of course, situations got even worse. And he speculated publicly. He says, I wonder what people in the Russian part, what language they will be speaking in another 20 years. So that is absolutely, the question is absolutely right. This is very much on their minds. And if you read, Russian literature, so Vladimir Sorokin's Day of the Oprichnik, it's all about, it's a dystopia, but it's all about a Russia which is an autocracy, but essentially has been taken over, is an economic colony of China. And that is their nightmare. And that, of course, is the calculation that the Trump administration is making, is that using that concern, can we peel them off? It's not a completely silly thought. I don't think that will happen in quite the same way, because Putin will stick to Xi so long as he's in a confrontation with the West. But I also don't think the PRC will necessarily be able to take over those areas, because this is not just an economic calculation. The Russian army could be quite effective in these. So, for example, if you think of what happened in the 1930s, the Russian army, which was kicked around really by the Finns, then by the Germans for quite a long time until it got its act together. But in 1938-39, the Red Army wiped the floor with the Japanese at Khankin-Gol and Nomonhan. So the PRC couldn't necessarily assume that it will simply roll over the Russians in the Far East. So the concern is there, but I don't expect that confrontation to happen so long as Putin is so fixated on Europe. Europe is his primary area of concern.
Thank you, Brendan. We've got one question in the room here, and then one more question in the room to finish off with. So the two gentlemen at the top front, they have to fight for it. So go here, we have one more question.
Thank you. So, Professor, you said in 2010 we were still, rocking nicely towards the end of history. What went wrong? And what is the single most fact? Who's the real villain of the piece to have brought us where we are just 15 years later? You seem to lay the blame at Putin's door primarily, but John Mearsheimer would disagree and say it's NATO. I actually think you could go back to 2001 and 2003 and blame Bin Laden and Bush, but you strongly say at 2010 we were still in the right direction. Who's at blame?
So I chose 2010 as a moment when, in general, people thought we were still moving in what we as in the West regard as the right direction. I don't myself think we were, because of course at that point we'd already had, for instance, the Russian cyber attack on Estonia. We'd had the invasion of Georgia, and of course we'd had Putin in his famous speech in February 2007 to the Munich Security Conference, warning, saying, we're not happy with the way things are going. So who you blame for this, as you imply, quite rightly, depends on where you stand. If you take Putin's view that Russia, in order to maintain itself as a great power and its equality with other great powers, has the right to enforce the absolute inequality of its immediate neighborhood. If you accept that proposition, then we in the West are in the wrong, because we're in favor of NATO enlargement and the EU enlargement and so on. If we accept our proposition, which is that the countries of Central and Eastern Europe have the right to determine their own future, they chose NATO and the European Union. It wasn't something that we forced upon them. It was something they very much wanted to embrace. So it depends on your answer to those two questions. I mean, mine is obviously clear, but I can see why if you have a different starting point, you would have a different outcome.
Good. Thank you very much, Brendan. Now we've got three gentlemen who are desperate to ask a question, but if you ask literally a one-sentence question, and then we might get three in 5 minutes.
Just very quickly, you mentioned earlier about the influence of artificial intelligence. But I was wondering, in the future, with artificial intelligence outside state control, and also the potential for cataclysmic climate change, will that not make it rather more difficult for great powers to control events in the way that they would like to?
Well, the great powers can't control climate, or at least they won't. But my great argument is that the great powers will kill us before. How do you define geopolitics? Geopolitics is what kills you before climate change does. So it's a more immediate threat. On AI, one view is that AI will simply accentuate the great power conflict because the quantities of compute required will tend to create ever larger blocks. The alternative school of thought says no. You know, DeepSeek, small actors, or at least allegedly small actor in the PRC, was able to do something reasonably comparable on a much smaller budget. So the jury's out how AI is going to influence this. But my suspicion simply is that AI will just be another platform that is being used like nuclear, like air, and like space. It will simply be refracted then through the great power antagonism. It won't fundamentally change that calculus.
Thank you.
Do you have a view on whether this great power conflict will strengthen or weaken liberal democracies as a form of governance?
So I'm an optimist, and I tend to think that democracies are slow to start, but they're strong to finish in any conflict. So I think that, you know, one of the great stories over the last 3 years has been the resistance of Ukraine, something which we simply could not have predicted. So I do think that the democracies will prevail. And one of the arguments of my Europe book was the way in which over time democracies are more effective in extraction and mobilization. That may not be true forever, but that, I'm just saying historically that has been the case, and that would be my expectation.
Thank you, Brendan. With 2 minutes to go, final question goes to this gentleman.
Very quickly. I was just wondering what your view was on the weaponization of debt and the vulnerability of the United States with actors like China holding so many T-bonds and the option to sell them off.
So nobody really knows what would happen if they did that. We saw, of course, because it could rebound on you. And people, I mean, the sovereign actors, I think, hold these bonds for two reasons. One, because they trust the United States, and secondly, because they don't, if you see what I mean. You know, actually, there seemed to have been some implication that the Japanese were moving or beginning, because their holdings of T-bonds are even greater than those of the PRC. It does seem as if the recent rowing back of Trump was because of the governmental bonds. It wasn't because of the stock market. But in a conflictual situation, if the PRC were to dump all those bonds, if we got to that point over, let's say, Taiwan or whatever, then the Japanese would most likely buy them because they would almost certainly be on the other side. So therefore, I don't think it's the nuclear weapon that it might be. However, if everybody did, because the entire world had lost confidence in Trump and the American system, which is not a completely incredible proposition now, that might be different. But we're still some way off from that.
Okay, folks, that is it. I think we covered centuries of geopolitics. We covered lots of different potential trajectories. None of them look particularly rosy, I must say. And in particular, when you look at a world that needs to come together to sort out global existential threats, it's not at all clear that will be the case, whether that's climate change, but even potential common goods like nuclear fusion or artificial intelligence, may well not be shared as freely across the globe as we may want. So plenty of food for thought, but please put your hands together for a fantastic talk by Brendan Simpson.